APIs are all about transferring data, and that data could be through one of our connected integrations like Go High Level or HubSpot, or through any data service that is accessible through a REST API endpoint. In this video, we'll discuss how to access data through a GET endpoint method. This is the best way for your AI assistant to access external data for use in the call. And that data may be customer information, schedule availability, product information, or more. The GET endpoint is all about providing your AI assistant with the data that they need to handle their call successfully. Now, we'll be covering other endpoint methods in this series. In the next video, we'll discuss the post method, which will allow your AI assistant to add new information to your data. And following that, we'll cover the patch method to update existing records. Custom actions help you empower your AI assistant in countless ways. My name is Carson Long with Synthflow. Let's get started. From the Synthflow home screen, click Actions and Custom Actions. Here, you'll see all existing custom actions, their method and endpoints, and if they are being utilized by any AI assistants. From this screen, you can also edit or duplicate any action. When we click Create, we have the choice to create a new action from scratch or to view marketplace templates. Now, we'll be exploring the marketplace in a later video, but it's worth noting that you don't have to create every action from scratch. There are plenty of common uses for custom actions that you can access and implement from the marketplace itself. We're going to create a new custom action. The first screen that you see is the Connection tab. This is where you select the endpoint method, GET in our case, populate the endpoint URL, and add any headers that the endpoint might be expecting. Let's talk about APIs. As a reminder, you are not creating an API within Synthflow. You are simply accessing it or calling it. APIs are built and configured elsewhere and are called from the custom action. Now, most services have pretty great API documentation. It's best to know what the API endpoint is expecting when you call it from Synthflow. And that includes any necessary headers, authentication, and the required parameters. If you're trying to return customer information to your AI assistant, you need to know what information the API needs to identify that customer. In our example today, we're going to use this API full of fake data to return a list of products that our customer might be interested in buying. This will simulate your AI assistant retrieving inventory or services to sell to the customer. This API, dummy JSON, has a couple different API endpoints that you can use for testing, all for free. In the Connection tab, type in the API endpoint. Now, this endpoint will return a list of products related to our search term phone. If I navigate over to initialize action, I can actually test this API call and see what information is returned. We get a long list of products and all of their additional information. Great, our API is working. Back to the Connection tab. Headers are metadata included in the API request to help the API operate successfully. Common headers you might see in your documentation might be content type, which will inform the API how to structure its response. Usually this will be XML or JSON. And if we need that, we can add a header and type in the key value pair based on the API documentation for our endpoint. If no headers are expected, we can delete these key value pairs easily. It's common for the API key or bearer token, which is how the API calls are secured and metered, to be present in the header. But we have a separate tab for authentication. Accessing secure data, like customer information, will typically require some sort of authentication. Toggle on the authorization to view the necessary details. For accessing data in our partnered integrations, like Go High Level or HubSpot, this process is easy. Simply connect your account to Synthflow and authentication is automatically configured. For custom authentication, provide the location where the authentication details are required, like the header, and then the key value pair. As an example, the CRM Zoho expects the Zoho OAuth token in the header. Authentication key is authorization, and the value is Zoho OAuth token, followed by the token that Zoho generates for your account. how to get your API key or bearer token or Zoho OAuth token should be present in your API documentation. In some cases, authorization might not even be needed, like if you were accessing an API that returns non-secure information. You might use an API to gather weather information or time zone conversions or more. This kind of information may not require authentication at all, and if so, toggle off the authorization at the top of the page. The Configure tab is extremely important. It determines when your custom action runs, query parameters, and your variables. The type of action, before the call or during the call, is determined by the purpose of your custom action. If your AI assistant needs to gather information to be used by this custom action, like asking a customer their location or name or email or some other identifying information, then this action can't run before the call. It must run during the call in order to give the AI assistant time to gather that information. You would run a custom action before the call in order to return information that your AI assistant needs right at the beginning of the call. In cases like this, we can click to add default variables. The user phone number and call ID are automatically created. Now, these variables are placeholders for more dynamic data. In this case, depending on what phone number you're connected to, the user phone number is going to be populated differently. So each time we reference this variable in the custom action, it's going to be replaced with the proper phone number. Anytime that you create a variable, you should populate some sort of example data. This will be important later when we run the custom action to test the connection and view that information it returns. These example value fields replace the variable for our testing. And of course, the variables will be replaced by real data in the call. If you're running a custom action during the call, you might need different variables that your AI assistant collects from the customer. These variables are created the same way as before, except now you must provide a description and a data type. In our example, let's imagine that the AI assistant asks our customer if they're interested in purchasing any products. We can ask the customer what they're interested in. Is it a phone accessory? Is it related to technology or sports? Our API includes a search function. We can take that type of product our customer is interested in and then return a list of products from our API that are related to that term. To do this, let's create a variable and we'll name it product type and give it a description. This description here should be really detailed. It helps the AI assistant identify the information from the call that should be stored in this variable. And the data type is important because your API endpoint is expecting data in a particular format. When you create a variable in a custom action, you can reference that variable in any text field within the custom action. And this includes the endpoint URL and the Authentication tab. For example, navigate back to the Connect to the API section and add this variable here. Variables should always be surrounded by angle brackets. Now, instead of returning a list of products related to the phone category every time, we can return a list of products based on the customer's response. You can see here how variables allow for dynamic information. But this is still a little messy. There's a better way to configure this API call. Let's remove everything beyond this search term and go back to the Configure tab. A common way that APIs require data in the API call is through query parameters. Query parameters append data into the URL when that API is called. We can achieve that same API endpoint that we had before in a cleaner way by creating a new query parameter. This will append a question mark followed by our key and value pairs. Now, the documentation tells me that the API endpoint is expecting a key of Q and a value of a product type, and that's where our variable will go. Query parameters are especially useful when your API endpoint requires a lot of them. This weather API that I use returns weather information for a specific location. It expects multiple query parameters in the URL. And now you can see how using query parameters can keep things more organized than populating one long API endpoint. The next step in configuring your custom action is to navigate to General Settings. Give your custom action a name and an appropriate description. The final field here informs your AI assistant on what to say while the API request is running. This should be fairly short as API requests happen pretty quickly. With that, the configuration is done and there's just one final step. Navigate to the Action Results tab and initialize the action. This will run the API call. And if everything is set up correctly from authentication to your variables, then your API will return successfully. For your assistant to actually use any of these returned variables in the call, use this table to check which values are shared with the assistant. In my case, the API returned a lot of information. If I want to return the title of the very first product returned, I can follow the structure of the data. Results, data, product, 0, title. Checking that box will return the title of the first product. If I want to see a list of all the product titles returned, I can check the field associated with these empty brackets. This returns an array of product titles for my assistant to use. When your custom action returns so much information, make sure to use the search field to find the information that you need. With the custom action fully configured, it can now be added to an AI assistant by typing in the prompt. We'll have a more detailed video on this at a later time, but here's a really basic implementation. Simply prompt the customer for a type of product, and then tell the AI assistant to run the custom action, and then how to use the returning information. In this case, I just tell the AI assistant to read the products back to the customer, no coding needed. Custom actions make your AI assistants truly versatile. Any data accessible through an API becomes data that you can use in your call. Create the action, choose your method, populate the endpoint, provide authentication details if needed, and utilize variables to keep your custom actions dynamic. If you weren't able to get a successful API response, review the formatting of your variables, your data types, your authentication details, and your source API documentation. In the next video, we'll be using custom actions to add new records to our database using the post method.